Zimbabwe in 1996. So is that at the height of the violence and reclaiming of the farms?
It actually wasn't too bad back then.
No?
So the process of kind of moving farms out of white ownership back into black Zimbabwean ownership started, my memory's going to be faulty here, so started sort of mid-90s. And then it accelerated towards the end of the decade and then got particularly bad like 98, 99, 2000s.
Was that under Mugabe, though?
Under Mugabe, yeah.
But was inflation still hitting high then?
It was pretty bad even when I was a teenager. So
Okay.
a lot of my pegging to inflation is associated with pocket money. So like my first I've still got the $2 bill that I got when my first tooth came out. I stuck it in a piggy bank, found it years later. Rather sadly, it now sits on my wall together with a $100 billion bill, which represents about the same value. But I keep them together on a display.
That's some pretty heavy inflation there.
Pretty horrific. It was running at between 20 to 50% inflation when I was a teenager.
Which is moderately good for Zimbabwe, but if that hit us, that would be horrendous.
50% inflation is insane. You lose half your purchasing power in a single year.
How old were you?
16 when we left.
Okay, but how old were you? So when you start, as a child, I was aware of inflation. I've talked about this on the podcast, on the news. They'll say inflation is just above a target of 2%, and I always just thought it was like a sign of growth. Okay, great, that's their target. They want to see. I never really paid any of attention to it properly until we made this show. And I had no need as a kid to understand it.
No.
But as a kid, did you naturally understand it because of what was happening?
I think from a perspective of knowing your purchasing power is diminishing, and as a kid, you're aware that the money you're getting, the money you're earning, is diminishing in its ability to purchase things.
Yeah.
So silly example I often use is deposits for bottles. So Zimbabwe always had a Coke bottle deposit system, and a Coke used to be $2, but you'd get $1 back if you took the glass bottle back to the store.
That's a good return.
It was good. It was fantastic, and particularly for scrappy kids like us. So loads of people would drink these things at our rugby games at the weekend, and if you stay behind after the match, you go around and collect 30, 40 different bottles.
Do you know what the modern version of that is?
No.
So at Bedford Rugby Club, they have the reusable cups.
Yeah, they do it at Twickenham as well.
Yeah, and you basically see these kids going around saying, "You done with your cup?" And everyone's like, "Oh, go on then." And so you see these kids walking around with like a tower of cups, like up under their arm, going over their shoulder. And you're looking like, that's fucking 30 quid there. And so they take them back and they get £1 for each one, and they go around and do it again. These kids are making 40, 50, 60 pounds at a rugby match.
Yeah, it's a great idea.
And you can't say no. No, I want my £1. Fuck off, 10-year-old.
No, the kids are clearing up and they're making some pocket money.
Yeah, good for them.
But it becomes noticeable when the price of the Coke wildly accelerates beyond the price of the deposit.
Right.
And that's the kind of thing you notice as a kid, or the fact that you're, instead of getting $2 for a tooth, that's not really buying it anymore, and you maybe need to be getting $10, $15, $20 for a tooth. And it very quickly begins to accelerate out of control. And I mean, ironically, Zimbabwe is probably the best working example we have in recent history of how it accelerates. At one point, the government stopped putting out official inflation figures because they were meaningless. They were so big you can't even imagine the number.
And can I ask what trade your parents were in?
Sure. So, I mean, you see from my background, I lived in various odd places. So I was raised by my stepdad and my mum. Okay. So my parents separated when I was about 4 or 5 years old. And my stepdad's job he was with the British Council.
Okay.
So for anyone who hasn't heard of the British Council, they're like the cultural wing of Britain's self-publicity abroad. So they organise things like scholarships, and they bring plays and performers over to different locations, and they set up links between universities in those jurisdictions and jurisdictions back home. And so we were sent off to the Middle East when I was 5, and then obviously various things happened there, which we make it into. And then Zim was my dad's last posting. And after his posting finished, he retired out there. So,
would he have been paid in pounds or local currency?
Interesting. So we actually saw both sides of it in Zim. So he was paid in pounds when he was still employed by the British Council, but he retired in '89, and then he took a bit of time out. And then he began teaching, And it was really noticeable at that point. So up until then, he'd been paid in sterling. And then when he began teaching, he was paid in local currency. And our family's personal financial circumstances took a massive nosedive at that point. It actually became quite tough.
Because of the inflation.
Well, you're paid in local currency. And as we're seeing in the UK at the moment, typically when inflation is going insane, salaries never keep pace with inflation. And that's the kind of thing that precipitates the strikes that we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah.
And, you will have seen the pronouncements from Andrew Bailey recently talking about be very, very good if, you didn't increase your prices, or if you didn't ask for a pay rise.
Yeah, just stop printing money, Andrew, you fucking prick.
Well, did you see the Telegraph story yesterday?
Oh my God, did you see that?
I did. I saw you tweeted.
Yeah, I mean, I took that from Dominic Frisby, hat tip mate. That it's got nothing to do with them.
I thought the Telegraph's headline was quite funny. They were clearly taking the piss. It said, rampant inflation has nothing to do with our wanton money printing, or something like that.
So you were experiencing that. Your father and mother's wealth is eviscerating before their eyes.
Yeah, pretty much. At an astonishingly fast pace. It is difficult to describe, unless you've experienced it, how the loss of 50% of your purchasing power year on year feels. And we in Zimbabwe there's really no free education to speak of. There are some government schools, and there are some bigger privately owned schools, but broadly speaking, everyone pays to attend school.
Yeah,
everyone's earning in some Zim dollars, as they were then, paying in Zim dollars, and the schools are upping their prices. And obviously, the horrific thing with like a global inflation is that none of the price increases ever keep up with each other. There are always some that are increasing faster than others, and the ones that increase faster than others tend to be the absolute necessities: food, water, housing, electricity. And then there's this horrendous lag where your income is not keeping pace with your outgoings. And then what choice do you have other than to strike?
Yeah. I mean, this is the highest inflation I've lived through as an adult. I don't know if it was high when I was a kid, but it's the highest I've lived through. And I'm noticing things. So whatever they claim the inflation is, I think they say about 10%.
About 10.
I think depending on what it is, it's between 10 and 20%. So we've seen a massive increase in our energy prices. I've just bought a bar, which I close on today.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And everybody is raising their prices. Various other things with property, insurance. My insurance has gone up. I'm seeing it all. But at the same time, we're not raising our prices on the podcast. So, we're not raising our drinks in the bar because we know everyone's being hit. But at the same time, you have to rethink your staff. They have to be paid. So everything you don't want to go goes up, and everything you want to go up goes up can't. And so that's my experience at 10 to 20%. It's annoying. It's survivable. You rethink and reshuffle. If you took that to 50%, I actually don't know. I can't envisage the consequences, especially if that was year after year. I cannot imagine what that's like.
Tends to accelerate as well.
Yeah.
And there are also all kinds of other second-order consequences which may be unseen at the beginning of the process. And one of the most obvious is that people stop saving. So if you know that your money is going to be worth half this time next year as what it's worth today, why the hell would you put it in your bank? Spend it.
But even at 10% inflation, I'm looking at the money in my bank and thinking, well, I should do something with it.
I think it's 6 years. So at 10% inflation, doesn't the maths work? It's 5 or 6 years you've lost half your purchasing power.
Well, because it's compounded though.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it would. I would have estimated 6 years you've lost it all. I don't know. I'd have to do the maths.
It's a weird bit of maths.
Yeah, no, it's an inverse, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, you're probably right. Yeah. I mean, I'm even looking at anything I have, which is cash now. I'm thinking I should spend it or put it somewhere. But then does that compound inflation because you're spending more?
Well, again, it gets to the root problem of all of this. Why the hell should you have to spend your time thinking about this instead of doing something productive with your time?
Yeah.
It means everyone has to be a financial engineer. And that's a gigantic waste of your time, talents, and brain power. And people shouldn't have to do that kind of stuff.
And so, was this happening prior to Mugabe, or can you blame all of this on Mugabe?
It was a lot of it was to do with what happened to the economy. So Zimbabwe, I mean, I have to say, cards on the table, I loved living in Zimbabwe. It was a wonderful place to grow up. It had the most fantastic climate in the world. Harare is one of the only cities, definitely one of the only capital cities, I think, where you don't need heating or air conditioning.
Huh.
Lovely climate. And the education system in Zim was terrific. You know, it was genuinely, hand on heart, it was a wonderful place to grow up.
And how integrated was it between the blacks and the whites?
For my generation, pretty good. So we were too young to remember much segregation. And actually, our school had let the first black pupils attend in the 60s.
Okay.
So there'd been 2 or 3 different generations. Like I was at school with a boy called Douglas Chingoka, and his uncle, I think it was Peter Chingoka, had been one of the first black kids at St. George's.
But would it have been all levels of prosperity mixing, or was it the more fortunate, wealthy blacks mixing with the historic white population?
Yeah, that's a good question. So independence in Zim happened in 1980.
Yeah.
Just missed it, actually. April the 4th, I think it was. So.
Okay.
Oh, no, April the 8th.
Were you born there?
No, I was born in London.
Okay.
And then moved to Syria when I was 5, and then on to Zim when I was 8.
Okay.
So our class was pretty. I was minority white, so the majority of my school was black. We had a reasonably big Asian community as well, but we'd all grown up in a free Zimbabwe that was independent, and to this day, you know, we've still got WhatsApp groups going with my class from Zim, and there's very good, I think, you know, certainly mixing in terms of races, but the economic point you raise is completely valid. You know, there's a huge stratification in terms of,
It's fine.
in terms of where you sit in the wealth stratum. And there was no real middle class to speak of previously in Zimbabwe. So a lot of Western society, you've got like a 3 stratum of societies. You've got largely divided in terms of wealth. In Zim and a lot of other countries of that nature, you tend to have sort of 2 divides. You have an elite, and then you have a larger group of people at the bottom.
Right.
And it's very hard to move between those. In fact, it's harder to move, obviously, between the lower levels and the elite than it is to move between the classes in the UK. Difficult though that can be as well.
Right. Do you know about this, the redistribution of the farms?
I mean, I've heard about it. I don't know in detail though.
Yeah, I mean, you should probably explain it better than I would. But my question with regards to that is, I'm fully aware that the program to redistribute the farms was chaotic, badly thought through, dangerous, led to death, murder of farmers, fear and people fleeing the country, and then a destruction of the productivity of the farms because they were handed over to people who didn't know how to operate a farm. Like I'm aware of a lot of that. Please add context where I've got it wrong. But was there any validity to the idea that there should be something done to redistribute opportunity?
I think almost everyone you speak to would say yes, that should have happened, because these were by and large farms which had been taken from, in some cases, ancestral lands, and people have been forcibly moved off their territory.
Okay.
Not necessarily by the farmers who were operating the farms at the time, but maybe by their ancestors or by people 100 years ago. So the question of distribution of land is very, very difficult to talk about, because I think most people would agree with the aims and goals, which was to try and give people back their land which had been forcibly taken from them.
But forcibly taking it from current owners.
It could have been done in a more thoughtful and better way. For example, your point about giving the farms to people. So a lot of the farms in Zimbabwe were absolutely gigantic. Some of them was the size of small counties in the UK.
Wow. Okay.
And to manage a farm of that size, you needed an army of people, an enormous amount of infrastructure to manage a farm that big. If at independence people had started to be trained how to manage those farms, and if there had been some form of compulsory purchase of those farms at market value, and then when those farms were purchased, black farmers had been put in who knew what they were doing, and a lot of the farms were split up, and you lose some of the economy of scale if you split up a gigantic tobacco farm and try and run it as 80,000 small tobacco farms. It doesn't really work. So I think the spirit of land redistribution was right insofar as this land was unlawfully taken in many cases from people whose ancestral land it was. But the way in which it happened was unfortunately chaotic and ultimately led to a lot of the destruction of the agricultural prosperity of Zimbabwe, which itself precipitated a lot of the inflation.
Yeah. And was it where did the idea come from? Was it directly from Mugabe, and was it kind of populist idea, or was there an ongoing generational debate regarding this?
It's old. It's an old idea. So there were a couple of different liberation struggles in Zimbabwe. They were called the Chimurengas, which roughly translates as Liberation War. The one that most people will be familiar with is the war that was fought against Ian Smith's Rhodesian army. There was a guerrilla war in the late 70s and very early 80s. And to be honest, a lot of it did boil down to land. Black Zimbabweans were moved off land. They were concentrated into... It was never as bad as apartheid in South Africa, which was much more horrific. But Black Zimbabweans were treated as second-class citizens, and that's awful. It shouldn't have happened.
Yeah. How is Zimbabwe now? What do you know?
I'm still in touch with a lot of people there and my friends up here. The inflation is going nuts again.
Okay.
Not as bad as it was. I think the rate is 150%. At least it was last time I checked.
I mean, that's still horrific.
I mean, it's still insane.
Yeah.
And they went through various periods of striking zeros off the notes.
Yeah.
The US dollar was used, as in many developing nations, as currency. And then the US dollar was arbitrarily banned. The government banned people from putting prices up.
Yeah.
The tried and tested means of controlling inflation.
Which never works.
It absolutely never works.
Yeah. Which
It's down to 92%.
Oh,
that's good. Manageable.